Alright, so this is just a quick follow-up lecture on the previous one where we talked about fading animations, because there's a little pitfall or difference in behavior to be aware of when using fadeIn and fadeOut versus the fadeTo function. Now you've already seen that when you use, let's say for the green box we say fadeOut, and I'm going to use 1 second just to make it a bit easier to see. Then when we look at that in the browser, you've already seen that once it faded out, it's actually removed from the layout. Now what this means in CSS terms, when you open up the developer console, you can clearly see that the green box just has a style of display none applied, which is the reason why all the other elements on the page then realign as if that element wasn't there at all. Now in some cases you may want that, but in some cases you may also just want it to fade out without actually being removed from the layout, so to say. So you don't want the display to be set to none, you just want the element to be invisible. And this is where the fadeTo function comes in. So when we instead go ahead and do fadeTo, also over 1 second, and then fade to 0% opacity, which is basically invisible, then when we go back to the browser, well, you can already see, but I'm going to reload this. Then you can see it's going to disappear. It's going to fade to opacity 0. So now there's no display none anymore here. It's only set to opacity 0. So the element becomes invisible, but it's not going to change the arrangement of the other boxes in this case that are surrounded. So the blue box doesn't go to the left because the green box is actually still there. It just has 0% opacity. Alright, so why did I say this can become a pitfall? So let's say we want to fade out the green box first, and then we want that to fade back in to, let's say, I'm gonna go for 50%. So let's say fadeTo over 1 second to 50%, and with fade out we only have one perimeter. So now this should fade out the green box and then fade it back in to 50% opacity. But let's go ahead and back to the browser. Now when I refresh this, you can see the green box disappears, but then it's not going to show up anymore. And you can actually see that it still has display none and the opacity is 50%, but the fadeTo function only changes the opacity. That's the difference that I just explained. So this can become a pitfall in exactly this case, where you actually want your element to be shown again, but with fadeOut, it has actually set the display to none. And when you then use fadeTo to fade it in again, that's not going to work because it doesn't set the display back to block in this case. So it's not going to touch that CSS property at all. So instead, to do this, you would have to set the display CSS property to block or something like that, and then fade the element to 50% opacity, which is also easy to do with jQuery, but we're going to do that in later lectures where we talk about setting CSS properties. Alright, so that's just something I wanted you to know in case you're playing around with this a bit and came across this issue. So the fadeOut and fadeIn will also set the display property. So fadeOut will, once it is finished, set the display property to none. And then the fadeIn will first set the display property back to whatever it was before, like block, inline block or something like that, and then begin changing the opacity. But the fadeTo function will only change the opacity and not touch the display property at all. So be aware of that, but once you know that, you will have no problem getting along with this. So I hope this was helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.